My name is Margaret Sinclair, and at 52 years old, I never thought my own son would try to destroy me. Standing in my storm-damaged living room, clutching the $30,000 repair estimate while my 28-year-old son Blake screamed, "Mom, this is financial suicide." I felt my world crumbling. But then something extraordinary happened. A yellowed envelope fell from the broken wall behind me, addressed in my late husband Robert's familiar handwriting. As I tore it open with trembling fingers, Blake's angry voice faded into nothing. The letter contained an address, investment details, and a stunning revelation that would change everything I thought I knew about our family's finances. Before we dive into this incredible journey of betrayal, discovery, and ultimate triumph, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please hit that like button if you've ever felt underestimated by your own family, and don't forget to subscribe because this story has twists you won't see coming. Trust me, by the end of this tale, you'll understand why sometimes the biggest risk isn't spending money on what you believe in, but trusting the wrong people with your dreams. Now, let me tell you how everything started to fall apart. The morning after Hurricane Sandra tore through our neighborhood, I stood surveying the damage to the house Robert and I had called home for 23 years. 3 years had passed since his sudden heart attack, and I was still learning to navigate life as a widow. The storm had been merciless, ripping off half the roof, flooding the basement, and leaving gaping holes in the walls where memories used to hang safely. My insurance adjuster, a tired-looking man named Frank Morrison, handed me the estimate with an apologetic grimace. $30,000 minimum, Mrs. Sinclair. Could be more if we find structural damage underneath. Blake arrived within the hour, his pristine Honda Accord looking out of place among the debris-scattered street. As an accountant at Henderson Financial Group, my son had always been cautious with money, but lately, his concern for my finances had grown into something that felt more like control. He stepped carefully through the wreckage, his designer shoes avoiding puddles as he surveyed the damage with the cold calculation of a spreadsheet. "Mom, you can't seriously be thinking about spending that kind of money on this old place," he said, his voice carrying that condescending tone that made me feel like a child being scolded for breaking something valuable. The house wasn't just a structure to me. Every creaking floorboard held memories of Robert's midnight wanderings when insomnia struck him. Every faded wallpaper seam marked the spot where we'd measured Blake's growth throughout his childhood. The kitchen still smelled faintly of Robert's weekend pancakes, and I couldn't bear the thought of walking away from the only place where I still felt his presence. My savings account, dwindled to $35,000 after 3 years of living on a modest insurance secretary's salary, represented my entire financial safety net. But this house, valued at $180,000, was my sanctuary. Blake paced through the ruins, his frustration mounting with each step. "You're being completely irrational about this, Mom. Dad's gone. He's been gone for 3 years, and you're still making decisions like he's coming home tomorrow." His words cut deeper than the hurricane winds had cut through my roof. "Look at the numbers. You've got barely enough savings to cover this repair, and then what? What happens when the furnace dies next winter? Or when the foundation needs work? You'll be broke, and I'll be the one cleaning up the mess." The accusation in his voice stung more than I cared to admit because part of me wondered if he was right. But as we stood arguing in the living room, something shifted. The damaged wall behind Robert's old reading chair gave way with a soft crumbling sound, revealing a space I'd never known existed. That's when the envelope fell at my feet like a gift from beyond. Blake stopped mid-sentence, his eyes following my gaze to the yellowed paper that seemed to glow against the water-damaged floorboards. My hands shook as I picked it up, recognizing immediately the careful script that had written me love letters for over 2 decades. Inside, I found a letter dated just 6 months before Robert's death, along with a deed and several official-looking documents I didn't understand. "My dearest Margaret," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and you've discovered my secret. I never told you about the warehouse investment because I wanted it to be a surprise for our retirement. The documents in this envelope represent our future security. Leonard Hayes at 4847 Industrial Boulevard knows everything. Trust him, and trust yourself. You're stronger than you know. All my love, Robert." Blake lunged forward, trying to snatch the papers from my hands. "Mom, don't fall for this. This has to be some kind of scam. Dad never mentioned any warehouse or any Leonard Hayes. You're grieving and vulnerable, and someone's obviously planted this to take advantage of you. His immediate dismissal of the discovery only strengthened my resolve to learn more. The Blake I'd raised would have been curious, excited even, about uncovering a mystery from his father's past. This Blake seemed only concerned with controlling every aspect of my life, and I was beginning to understand why. That night, after Blake finally left with angry warnings about financial responsibility and making smart choices, I sat alone at my kitchen table studying the documents by lamplight. The deed showed that Robert had purchased a 40% stake in a warehouse property for $50,000. The investment seemed legitimate, complete with notarized signatures and official county stamps. But more importantly, it represented something I desperately needed: hope that my future held more than just scraping by on my widow's pension and Blake's increasingly suffocating oversight. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 2 years and drove to 4847 Industrial Boulevard. The address led me to a sprawling complex of aging warehouses on the outskirts of town, where weeds pushed through cracked asphalt and industrial buildings squatted like sleeping giants in the morning haze. I almost turned around 3 times, Blake's warnings echoing in my mind about elderly people being targeted by sophisticated scams. But something about Robert's handwriting, the authentic feeling of those documents, pushed me forward. Leonard Hayes turned out to be a weathered man in his 60s with kind eyes and hands stained by decades of honest work. When I introduced myself as Robert's widow, his face broke into a genuine smile that immediately put me at ease. "Margaret, Robert talked about you constantly. He was so proud of you, always saying how you were the smartest person he knew but never gave yourself enough credit." Leonard led me through his office, walls covered with certificates, permits, and photographs of various warehouse projects spanning what looked like 40 years in the business. "Your husband was a quiet investor," Leonard explained, pulling out a thick folder marked Sinclair Partnership. "He approached me 5 years ago when I was looking for partners to buy this entire complex. The city had been talking about expanding the school district, and Robert had done his research. He knew this land would eventually become valuable." As Leonard spread the documents across his desk, I saw bank statements, property assessments, and correspondence between Robert and city planning officials that painted a picture of my husband I'd never known existed. The investment was real, more real than I'd dared hope. Robert had indeed purchased a 40% stake in the warehouse complex, and the city's school board had recently approved plans to purchase the entire property for a new elementary school and community center. "The buyout is scheduled for completion within 6 months, Leonard said, pointing to a letter from the municipal planning department. "At the proposed price, your 40% would be worth approximately $200,000. I drove home in a daze, my mind reeling from the implications. Robert had always handled our finances, but I'd assumed that meant he was conservative, safe, traditional. The idea that he'd been making strategic investments, planning for our future in ways I'd never imagined, made me feel like I was discovering a secret room in a house I thought I knew completely. But my euphoria was short-lived. As I pulled into my driveway, I saw Blake's car already waiting, and his expression through the windshield told me this conversation wasn't going to go well. Blake had somehow discovered my absence from work and had been calling my cell phone for hours. His concern had morphed into fury by the time I walked through my front door, and he immediately launched into an interrogation about where I'd been and what I'd been doing. When I tried to explain about Leonard and the warehouse, his reaction was even more explosive than I'd anticipated. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," he shouted, pacing through my damaged living room like a caged animal. "You disappear for an entire day, chasing some fantasy story about Dad being a secret real estate mogul, and you can't see how completely insane this sounds." His accusations stung because they played on my deepest fears about my own judgment. Since Robert's death, I'd questioned every decision, from what to eat for breakfast to how to pay the bills. Blake had positioned himself as my financial advisor, my protector, my guide through the complicated world of adult responsibilities. But now, faced with evidence that I might be capable of understanding complex investments and making my own decisions, he seemed determined to convince me that I was losing my mind. "Mom, listen to yourself," Blake continued, his voice taking on the patient tone usually reserved for small children or psychiatric patients. "You found some old papers in a wall, and now you think Dad was secretly wealthy? You met some stranger who claims to know about mysterious investments? This is textbook elder fraud, and you're walking right into it." The way he said, "elder fraud," made me flinch, as if my 52 years had somehow transformed me into a confused, vulnerable old woman incapable of critical thinking. But Blake made a crucial mistake that day. Instead of listening to the details, instead of examining the evidence, he demanded that I immediately stop all contact with Leonard Hayes and never speak of the warehouse investment again. His ultimatum felt less like protection and more like control, and for the first time since Robert's death, I felt a spark of the independence I'd buried along with my husband. "I'm going back tomorrow to learn more," I told him quietly. "And you can't stop me." The look on Blake's face was something I'd never seen before, not concern, not love, but genuine panic. As he stormed out of the house, promising to do whatever it takes to protect you from yourself, I realized that my son and I were no longer on the same side. The question was, why was Blake so determined to prevent me from potentially securing my financial future? What did he have to gain from keeping me dependent and uncertain? 3 days after my confrontation with Blake, my daughter Diane arrived unannounced from California. I hadn't seen her since Robert's funeral, and her sudden appearance on my doorstep should have been a joyful surprise. Instead, the tight line of her mouth and the way she avoided eye contact told me that Blake had called in reinforcements. At 30, Diane had inherited her father's gentle nature but her brother's stubborn streak, and I could see the conflict playing across her face as she hugged me hello. "Blake's really worried about you, Mom," she began carefully, settling into Robert's old armchair while I made coffee with trembling hands. "He says you've been acting strangely, making impulsive decisions, trusting strangers with money." The words sounded rehearsed, like she'd been practicing this conversation during the entire flight from Los Angeles. "Maybe it would help if we all sat down together and talked about your future. About what's really best for you right now." What followed was the most surreal family meeting of my life. Blake arrived within the hour, bringing with him a stack of papers and a demeanor that suggested he'd been planning this intervention for weeks. They'd researched elder care options, retirement communities, and financial management services, just to have options available. They'd spoken to my doctor about age-related cognitive changes, and had even contacted a lawyer about protective measures for vulnerable adults. The betrayal was breathtaking in its scope and calculation. While I'd been grieving, struggling to rebuild my life after losing my husband, my children had been quietly building a case for my incompetence. Blake had documented every unconventional decision I'd made since Robert's death: the time I'd bought an expensive dress for Robert's memorial service, the weekend I'd spent in bed crying instead of answering their calls, the day I'd forgotten to pay the electric bill because I was lost in memories. Individually, these incidents meant nothing. Together, they painted a picture of a woman in decline. "We've scheduled an appointment with Dr. Peterson for a cognitive assessment," Blake announced, as if he were discussing the weather. "And we've consulted with Gerald Morrison about establishing a conservatorship. Just temporary, just until you're thinking more clearly." The casual way he discussed stripping away my autonomy made my blood run cold. A conservatorship would give them complete control over my finances, my living situation, my medical decisions. I would become a child again in the eyes of the law, dependent on their judgment for every aspect of my existence. Diane shifted uncomfortably as Blake outlined their plan, and I caught her shooting him worried glances when she thought I wasn't looking. "Blake, maybe we're moving too fast," she said quietly. "Mom seems fine to me. Different since Dad died, but not incompetent." But Blake was relentless, presenting a folder full of research about widows who fall victim to financial scams, about the correlation between grief and poor decision-making, about the warning signs of age-related dementia. The most devastating part wasn't the accusation of mental decline, it was the realization that my son had been systematically undermining my confidence for months. Every time I'd questioned a financial decision, he'd told me I was overthinking things. Every time I'd expressed interest in learning about investments or estate planning, he'd redirected the conversation to simpler options. He'd positioned himself as the responsible adult managing an increasingly unreliable parent, and I'd been so grateful for his attention that I'd never recognized the manipulation. What if the warehouse investment is real? I asked desperately. What if Leonard Hayes is legitimate? What if I'm actually capable of making smart financial decisions? Blake's laugh was cold and dismissive. Mom, even if this warehouse story were true, which it isn't, you'd still be proving my point. Making major investment decisions without consulting family, trusting strangers, acting on impulse, these are exactly the behaviors that prove you need supervision. The circular logic was maddening. If the investment was fake, I was a victim of fraud who needed protection. If the investment was real, I was reckless and impulsive and needed protection. Either way, Blake had constructed a scenario where my independence was the problem and his control was the solution. As I listened to my children plan my future without my input, I understood that I was fighting for more than just $30,000 or a house repair. I was fighting for my right to exist as a complete human being. That night, after Blake and Diane left to give me time to process everything they'd shared, I sat in my damaged living room and finally allowed myself to cry. Not the gentle tears of grief I'd shed for Robert, but the angry, frustrated sobs of someone who'd just discovered that the people she trusted most in the world had been plotting against her. I was 52 years old, financially stable, mentally sound, and physically healthy, but my own children were trying to convince the world that I was incompetent. The question that kept me awake until dawn was simple: what did they hope to gain from my helplessness? The legal papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who looked embarrassed to be handing me documents that would change my life forever. Blake and Diane had filed for temporary conservatorship, claiming that I was suffering from age-related cognitive decline and making financial decisions that pose a risk to her welfare and security. The petition included statements from concerned family members, and a request for immediate freezing of my assets pending a psychiatric evaluation. Reading the legal language that reduced my life to a series of symptoms and warning signs was like watching someone else's story unfold. According to the petition, I had displayed erratic behavior including social withdrawal, neglect of personal finances, and susceptibility to potential fraud schemes. My grief after Robert's death was reframed as depression. My interest in the warehouse investment was labeled as impulsive and financially reckless behavior. Even my decision to repair my storm-damaged house was cited as evidence of poor judgment and inability to make rational decisions. Blake had been thorough in his documentation. He'd included bank statements showing my declining savings, photographs of my storm-damaged house, and even a statement from my supervisor at work noting that I'd seemed distracted and emotionally unstable in recent months. What hurt most was seeing my pain and vulnerability transformed into ammunition against me. Every moment of weakness, every tear shed in grief, every difficult day navigating life without Robert had been catalogued and weaponized by my own son. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks away, and until then, I was allowed to remain in my house but with severe restrictions. I could access only $500 per month from my accounts, just enough for basic living expenses. Any expenditure over $50 required approval from Blake, who had been granted temporary oversight of my finances. I couldn't sell anything, couldn't sign any contracts, couldn't even hire a contractor to repair my storm damage without court permission. Dr. Peterson's cognitive assessment was scheduled for the following week, and Blake had been kind enough to provide a list of concerning behaviors for the doctor to investigate. The trap was closing around me with terrifying efficiency, and I began to understand how easily an independent adult could be transformed into a ward of the state. All it took was family members willing to leverage the legal system's well-intentioned protections for vulnerable adults, and suddenly your autonomy was gone. My first instinct was to call Leonard Hayes, but Blake had anticipated this. When I dialed the warehouse office, Leonard told me that a young man claiming to be Robert's son had already contacted him with warnings about an elderly woman who might try to scam him out of money. He seemed very concerned about his mother's mental health, Leonard said sadly. He asked me not to encourage any delusions about warehouse investments if you contacted me again. Blake had moved quickly to cut off my access to the one person who could verify my story. The isolation was devastating. Blake had contacted my neighbors, my coworkers, and even my church group with carefully worded expressions of concern about my recent behavior. He never quite accused me of having dementia, but he planted seeds of doubt with phrases like, "She hasn't been herself since Robert died," and "We're worried she might be taken advantage of." People who had known me for years suddenly looked at me with pity and concern, speaking to me in the slow, careful tones reserved for the mentally impaired. Even worse was the way Blake had recruited allies within my own family. My sister Ruth called from Arizona with concerns that Blake had shared about my recent decisions. My brother-in-law started conversations with questions about whether I was taking care of myself and staying safe. The narrative Blake had constructed was spreading through my support network like a virus, transforming concerned relatives into unwitting participants in his campaign to prove my incompetence. The financial constraints were immediately crippling. I couldn't afford to hire a lawyer on my $500 monthly allowance, and legal aid services had a waiting list that extended months beyond my hearing date. I couldn't repair my house, couldn't travel to research the warehouse investment, couldn't even buy myself decent clothes for the court appearance where my future would be decided. Blake had engineered a situation where my poverty would serve as additional evidence of my poor judgment. But the most devastating attack came when Blake convinced Dr. Peterson to schedule a surprise home visit to assess my living conditions. The storm damage that I hadn't been allowed to repair was cited as evidence of failure to maintain safe living conditions. The stacks of legal documents I'd been studying were described as obsessive behavior and paranoid documentation. My research into conservatorship law was labeled as conspiracy theories and anti-family sentiment. Even my tears during the interview were noted as emotional instability and inappropriate affect. As I sat in my dark, damaged house that night, forbidden from using more than basic electricity to conserve my limited funds, I realized that Blake had constructed the perfect trap. Every attempt I made to prove my competence could be reframed as evidence of delusion. Every effort to defend myself could be dismissed as paranoid rambling. He'd created a scenario where fighting for my freedom actually strengthened his case against me. For the first time since Robert's death, I wondered if Blake might actually succeed in destroying everything I had left. The weeks leading up to the conservatorship hearing were the longest of my life. Confined to my damaged house with minimal funds and no legal representation, I felt like a prisoner awaiting execution. Blake had frozen my assets so effectively that I couldn't even afford to have my phone fixed when it started cutting out during calls, which he later cited as another example of my inability to manage basic responsibilities. Every day brought new restrictions, new forms to fill out, new appointments with court-appointed evaluators who spoke to me like I was already mentally incompetent. Dr. Peterson's cognitive assessment had been a nightmare of leading questions and assumptions. When I tried to explain the warehouse investment, he nodded with the patronizing sympathy reserved for patients experiencing delusions. When I showed him Robert's letter and the property documents, he noted in my file that I was fixated on conspiracy theories involving deceased husband, and showing signs of complicated grief with paranoid features. My perfectly normal responses to impossible questions were twisted into evidence of cognitive decline. The court-appointed social worker, Ms. Jennifer Barnes, visited my house and immediately focused on the storm damage I hadn't been allowed to repair. She photographed the holes in my walls, the water stains on my floors, and the tarp covering part of my roof, all while asking pointed questions about why I hadn't taken care of these problems. When I explained that Blake had frozen my accounts and I couldn't access repair funds, she made notes about blame-shifting behavior and failure to take responsibility for living conditions. Sleep became impossible as the hearing date approached. I lay awake calculating how long my limited funds would last, wondering if I'd end up in a state-supervised facility, trying to imagine what would happen to all my memories of Robert if Blake sold the house. The isolation was crushing. Former friends avoided my calls, family members spoke to me with careful concern, and even my mailman looked at me with pity. Blake had successfully convinced my entire social network that I was a tragic figure in decline rather than a competent adult being systematically destroyed by her own children. My lowest moment came when I finally contacted Patricia Wong, a lawyer who offered free consultations to seniors. Patricia was a young woman, probably close to Diane's age, and I expected her to dismiss my story as Blake had trained everyone else to do. Instead, she listened carefully as I explained about the warehouse investment, the legal documents, and Blake's sudden push for conservatorship. When I finished, Patricia leaned back in her chair and said something that nearly made me cry with relief. "Mrs. Sinclair, you don't sound incompetent to me. You sound like someone who's being financially abused by her own family." Patricia agreed to represent me for a reduced fee that I could barely afford, and she immediately began investigating Blake's claims. What she discovered was disturbing. Blake had been documenting my decline for over a year, photographing every pile of unopened mail, every unmade bed, every tear-stained tissue as evidence of my deteriorating mental state. He'd been building a case for conservatorship long before the warehouse investment provided his excuse to act. More troubling were the financial irregularities Patricia uncovered. Blake had been managing my accounts with increasing control since Robert's death, ostensibly to help me transition. But closer examination revealed that he'd been making unauthorized transfers, paying himself consulting fees for financial advice, and even using my credit card for his own expenses. The man who claimed to be protecting me from financial exploitation had been systematically stealing from me for months. Patricia also discovered that Blake was in serious financial trouble himself. He'd invested heavily in technology stocks just before the market correction and was facing margin calls that could bankrupt him. His mortgage was 3 months behind, his credit cards were maxed out, and his employer had put him on notice for poor performance related to his financial stress. The conservatorship wasn't about protecting me, it was about accessing my assets to save himself from financial ruin. "He needs you to be incompetent," Patricia explained during our preparation session. "If you're capable of managing your own affairs, he loses access to your money. If the warehouse investment is real, he loses the opportunity to liquidate your assets. The conservatorship isn't protection, it's theft with legal documentation." Understanding Blake's motivations was somehow both relieving and heartbreaking. My son wasn't trying to help me, he was trying to financially survive by destroying my independence. The night before the hearing, I sat in my damaged living room holding Robert's letter and thinking about the man I'd married and the children we'd raised together. Robert had always believed that people were fundamentally good, that even difficult situations could be resolved with patience and understanding. I wondered what he would think about Blake's actions, about Diane's complicity, about the family we'd built together tearing itself apart over money and control. For the first time since discovering the hidden letter, I wondered if fighting for my independence was worth destroying what remained of my relationship with my children. But then I thought about the alternative, spending the rest of my life as a legal ward, having my every decision scrutinized and approved by people who had proven they didn't have my best interests at heart. I thought about Robert's investment, about the financial security he'd tried to provide for my future, about the house we'd built together piece by piece over 23 years of marriage. I thought about the woman I'd been before grief and manipulation had made me doubt my own judgment. Tomorrow, I would walk into that courtroom and fight for the right to be Margaret Sinclair, not Blake's incompetent mother or the court's protected ward. Whatever the cost to my family relationships, I couldn't surrender the last piece of my authentic self. The morning of my hearing, I woke to find an unexpected visitor on my doorstep. Emma Rodriguez was a professional-looking woman in her 40s who introduced herself as a property appraiser working with the municipal planning department. "Mrs. Sinclair, I believe you might be interested in some information about the warehouse property on Industrial Boulevard," she said, and my heart nearly stopped beating. Emma had been hired by the city to conduct official appraisals of the warehouse complex as part of the school district's expansion project. Her research had led her to Leonard Hayes, who had mentioned his concern about Robert's widow being discouraged from claiming her rightful inheritance by family members who didn't understand the investment. Emma had taken it upon herself to investigate, and what she'd discovered was better than I'd dared hope. "The municipal purchase is absolutely legitimate," Emma explained, spreading official city documents across my damaged kitchen table. "The school board approved the acquisition 6 months ago, and we're scheduled to close on the property within 90 days. Based on my current appraisal, the total value is $250,000, which would make your 40% stake worth exactly $100,000. The numbers were real, documented, official. Robert's investment wasn't a fantasy or a scam. It was a careful, strategic decision that was about to secure my financial future. Emma had brought something even more valuable than validation: legal documentation. She'd worked with Leonard Hayes to compile every piece of paperwork related to Robert's investment, from the original purchase agreement to the recent city correspondence about the acquisition. The file was thick with contracts, bank records, property assessments, and official communications that would be impossible to fake or fabricate. Blake's accusations of fraud would crumble under the weight of legitimate government documentation. But Emma had uncovered something even more significant during her research. Leonard Hayes had mentioned that Robert had spoken about a separate savings account, something he'd called his emergency fund for Margaret's future. Working backward through bank records and estate documents, Emma had traced this account to a small credit union across town where Robert had quietly deposited money for 3 years before his death. The account, which required both his death certificate and my identification to access, contained $80,000 that I'd never known existed. "Your husband was quite the financial planner," Emma said admiringly. "The warehouse investment, the emergency fund, even the life insurance policies, he'd structured everything to provide maximum security for your independence. It's almost like he anticipated that you might need to defend your financial autonomy someday." The irony wasn't lost on me that Robert, who had always handled our finances quietly in the background, had actually been teaching me by example how to be financially independent. Emma's timing was perfect but not coincidental. Leonard Hayes had been following the legal proceedings through public records, and he'd been horrified to learn that Robert's careful planning was being undermined by accusations of his widow's incompetence. He'd reached out to every professional contact he could find, including Emma, asking them to verify the legitimacy of the investment and provide documentation for my legal defense. Patricia Wong arrived at my house an hour later, and her reaction to Emma's documentation was immediate and decisive. "This changes everything," she said, photographing every page and making detailed notes. "We're not just defending against conservatorship anymore, we're exposing financial abuse and proving that your judgment was correct all along. Blake's entire case falls apart when we show that your delusional investment is actually worth more than your house." Together, Emma and Patricia helped me understand something crucial about my situation. Blake's campaign to prove my incompetence wasn't just about accessing my current assets, it was about preventing me from discovering Robert's hidden financial planning. If I'd been declared incompetent before the warehouse sale was finalized, Blake would have controlled the $100,000 from that transaction plus the $80,000 from the emergency fund. My protection would have made him nearly $200,000 richer while leaving me dependent on his generosity for basic survival. Emma also provided insight into Blake's psychological tactics. Financial abusers often isolate their victims by convincing them they're incapable of understanding money, she explained. They create dependence by undermining confidence, then position themselves as the only reliable source of guidance. It's a form of emotional manipulation that's particularly effective against people who are already vulnerable from grief or major life changes. As we prepared for the afternoon hearing, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Robert's death: genuine confidence in my own judgment. The evidence was overwhelming, the documentation was unassailable, and my allies were competent professionals who believed in my capabilities. For months, Blake had been telling me I was confused, irrational, and incapable of making good decisions. Now I had proof that I'd been right about everything important. The investment was real, the documents were legitimate, and my instincts about Leonard Hayes had been sound. The most powerful moment came when Emma handed me the keys to the emergency fund safety deposit box. "Your husband left detailed instructions about this account," she said. "He wanted you to have complete financial independence if anything happened to him. He believed you were strong enough and smart enough to manage your own future." Holding those keys felt like receiving Robert's blessing from beyond the grave, validation that I was the capable woman he'd fallen in love with and married, not the confused widow Blake had convinced me I'd become. Walking into the courthouse that afternoon, I carried with me not just legal documents and professional testimony, but something far more valuable: the certainty that I was fighting not just for money or property, but for my right to honor the trust Robert had placed in my strength and intelligence. Blake had tried to convince the world that I was incompetent, but the truth was about to prove that I was exactly the woman my husband had believed me to be. The conservatorship hearing was held in Judge Eleanor Morrison's courtroom, a formal space that felt more like a trial than the administrative proceeding I'd expected. Blake and Diane sat at one table with their lawyer, Gerald Morrison, a polished man in an expensive suit who looked like he specialized in winning at any cost. Blake wore his most serious expression, the one he'd perfected for client meetings at the accounting firm, while Diane kept her eyes focused on her hands, avoiding eye contact with me entirely. Judge Morrison, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and sharp eyes, reviewed the case file while both sides prepared their arguments. I sat beside Patricia Wong feeling oddly calm despite the magnitude of what was happening. This hearing would determine whether I retained control of my life or became a legal ward of my own children. Everything I'd worked to understand about Robert's investments, about my own capabilities, about Blake's true motivations, would be tested in the next 2 hours. Gerald Morrison opened with a presentation designed to paint me as a tragic figure whose grief had compromised her judgment. He presented enlarged photographs of my storm-damaged house, financial records showing my declining savings, and statements from neighbors and family members expressing concern about Margaret's recent behavior. His argument was simple and devastating. A vulnerable widow was making increasingly poor decisions and needed family protection before she lost everything to scammers and poor judgment. Mrs. Sinclair has demonstrated a clear pattern of financial irresponsibility, Gerald Morrison argued smoothly. She's contemplating spending her entire life savings on repairing a house that may not be worth the investment. She's pursuing phantom business deals based on mysterious documents that conveniently appeared after decades of being hidden. She's isolated herself from family members who are trying to help, and she's showing classic signs of paranoid thinking that often accompanies age-related cognitive decline. Blake took the witness stand and delivered a performance that would have been convincing if I hadn't learned the truth about his motivations. He spoke about his concern for my welfare, his observations of my declining judgment, and his fear that I was being targeted by sophisticated criminals who prey on grieving widows. His voice trembled with what appeared to be genuine emotion as he described watching his mother lose herself in the years since his father's death. To anyone who didn't know about his financial troubles, Blake would have seemed like a devoted son trying to protect a confused parent. My mother hasn't been the same since Dad died, Blake testified, his voice breaking slightly. She's been making impulsive decisions, trusting strangers, neglecting basic responsibilities. When she told me about this warehouse investment, I knew she was being scammed. The idea that my father, who was always completely transparent about our family finances, would have made secret investments worth hundreds of thousands of dollars is simply impossible. Diane's testimony was more painful because I could see the genuine conflict in her eyes. She loved me and wanted to protect me, but Blake had convinced her that protection meant taking away my independence. Mom has always been emotional, but since Dad's death, she's become almost childlike in some ways, Diane said quietly. She cries frequently, she forgets important tasks, and she seems to be living in a fantasy world where Dad is still providing for her from beyond the grave. I don't want to control her life, but I'm terrified that she's going to lose everything Dad worked so hard to provide. When Patricia Wong stood to present our defense, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted dramatically. She began by introducing Emma Rodriguez, whose professional credentials and municipal employment immediately commanded respect. Emma's testimony about the warehouse acquisition was dry, factual, and completely devastating to Blake's case. She presented the City Council resolutions, the Planning Committee reports, and the official appraisal documents that proved beyond any doubt that Robert's investment was legitimate and valuable. The property acquisition is a matter of public record, Emma testified matter-of-factly. The Sinclair estate's 40% ownership is documented in the county land records. The municipal purchase price has been approved by the City Council and budgeted by the school district. Mrs. Sinclair's inheritance from this transaction will be approximately $100,000, which hardly suggests that she's the victim of a scam. Leonard Hayes took the stand next, and his 40 years of legitimate business dealings spoke louder than any character witness could have. He produced correspondence with Robert dating back 5 years, showing a careful, strategic investment plan rather than an impulsive decision by a grieving widow. He also revealed that Blake had contacted him with warnings about an incompetent elderly woman who might try to claim Robert's investment, essentially proving that Blake had been working to prevent me from accessing my legitimate inheritance. But the most powerful moment came when Patricia presented evidence of Blake's financial troubles. Bank records, credit reports, and employment documentation painted a clear picture of a man facing financial ruin who needed access to his mother's assets for his own survival. The conservatorship petition had been filed just 2 weeks after Blake received a foreclosure notice on his house, and his financial situation was so desperate that he'd been borrowing money from credit cards to pay basic expenses. Mr. Sinclair isn't trying to protect his mother, Patricia argued. He's trying to gain legal access to her assets to solve his own financial problems. The timing of this conservatorship petition, combined with his attempts to prevent Mrs. Sinclair from claiming her legitimate inheritance, suggests that this entire proceeding is about financial exploitation rather than protection. When I finally took the witness stand, I felt none of the confusion and uncertainty that had plagued me for months. I spoke clearly about my research into the warehouse investment, my discovery of Robert's hidden planning, and my growing understanding of Blake's true motivations. I acknowledged my grief, my mistakes, and my moments of doubt, but I also demonstrated my ability to learn, adapt, and make rational decisions under pressure. Your Honor, I'm not claiming to be perfect or infallible, I said. I've made mistakes since my husband's death, and I've struggled with grief and loneliness. But I've also successfully researched a complex investment, identified legitimate professional contacts, and uncovered evidence of financial planning that my son was attempting to hide from me. These aren't the actions of an incompetent person, they're the actions of someone who's learning to be independent again. Judge Morrison's questions were sharp and probing, but I answered them directly and honestly. She asked about my future financial plans, my understanding of the warehouse investment, and my relationship with my children. I explained that I wanted to repair my house, claim my inheritance, and rebuild a relationship with Blake and Diane based on mutual respect rather than my dependence on their judgment. I also made it clear that I understood the legal implications of conservatorship and was prepared to prove my competence through actions rather than words. The judge's ruling was swift and unambiguous. Not only did she deny the conservatorship petition, but she ordered an immediate investigation into Blake's financial management of my accounts and required him to repay any unauthorized transfers with interest. She also restored my complete financial autonomy and warned both Blake and Diane that any future attempts to manipulate or exploit my assets would result in criminal charges. Mrs. Sinclair has demonstrated sound judgment, thorough research skills, and appropriate caution in her financial decision-making, Judge Morrison stated. The evidence suggests that her children's concerns about her competence may be motivated more by their own financial needs than by any genuine decline in her capabilities. This conservatorship petition is denied, and Mrs. Sinclair's assets are immediately released from any restrictions. As we left the courtroom, Blake's face was pale with shock and rage. He'd invested months in building his case, convinced that his superior education and professional status would triumph over my emotional delusions. Instead, he'd been publicly exposed as a potential financial abuser whose own poor judgment had led him to attempt stealing from his grief-stricken mother. The son who had tried to have me declared incompetent was walking away financially ruined and legally humiliated, while the mother he'd underestimated was about to become independently wealthy. The first thing I did after regaining control of my finances was hire the best construction crew in town to repair my storm-damaged house. The $30,000 renovation that Blake had called financial suicide became a celebration of my newfound independence and confidence. Watching the workers tear out damaged walls and rebuild the foundation felt symbolic of what I was doing to my entire life, removing the broken pieces and constructing something stronger and more beautiful than what had existed before. Within 6 weeks, my house was transformed from a storm-ravaged shell into something more magnificent than it had ever been during my marriage to Robert. The new kitchen featured modern appliances and custom cabinetry that reflected my personal taste rather than compromises made during 23 years of shared decisions. The living room, where I'd discovered Robert's hidden letter, now had floor-to-ceiling windows that filled the space with natural light and a sense of openness I'd never experienced before. The warehouse sale closed exactly as Emma Rodriguez had predicted, and the $100,000 from Robert's investment landed in my account like a gift from the future he'd envisioned for me. Combined with the $80,000 from the emergency fund account, I suddenly had more money than I'd ever controlled independently. But more important than the financial security was the validation that my judgment had been sound, my instincts reliable, and my capabilities far greater than Blake had ever acknowledged. I also discovered something Robert had never told me. The life insurance policy he'd purchased just 2 years before his death was worth twice what I'd been receiving in benefits. The insurance company had been paying me the minimum spousal benefit while the full policy amount sat unclaimed because no one had filed the proper paperwork. Emma helped me navigate the bureaucracy, and another $40,000 appeared in my accounts, money that Robert had intended for my comfort and security. Blake's financial situation, meanwhile, deteriorated rapidly after the conservatorship hearing. His employer terminated him for the poor performance and ethical concerns that had emerged during the legal proceedings, and his house went into foreclosure within 2 months. He approached me several times, alternating between apologies and demands for financial help, but I'd learned the difference between supporting someone and enabling their destructive behavior. "You made your choice when you tried to steal my independence," I told him during our final conversation. "Now you'll live with the consequences." Diane's response was more complex and painful. She genuinely hadn't understood Blake's financial motivations and was horrified to learn that she'd been manipulated into supporting his attempt to exploit me. She sent long letters of apology from California, explaining how Blake had convinced her that I was suffering from dementia and needed protection. But forgiveness, I discovered, was something I could control and choose to give or withhold, not something that could be demanded or expected simply because we shared DNA. I channeled my energy into creating the life Robert had always encouraged me to pursue but I'd been too afraid to embrace. The renovated house became a source of rental income when I converted the basement into a beautiful apartment that attracted young professionals who appreciated the quiet neighborhood and my hands-off management style. The rental income, combined with my investment returns and Robert's insurance benefits, gave me financial freedom I'd never imagined possible. More importantly, I began making decisions based on my own interests and desires rather than other people's expectations or judgments. I enrolled in a real estate investment course at the community college, not because I needed to make more money, but because I wanted to understand the field that had provided my financial independence. I traveled to places Robert and I had always planned to visit, someday, finally understanding that someday was a luxury I could create for myself. Emma Rodriguez became not just a professional contact but a genuine friend who introduced me to a community of independent women who'd navigated similar challenges with family, finances, and personal autonomy. Through Emma, I met other widows who'd been pressured to make safe decisions that would have kept them dependent and small, and together we formed an informal support network for women learning to trust their own judgment in financial and personal matters. The most satisfying victory came when Leonard Hayes invited me to become a partner in his next warehouse development project. My investment knowledge, gained through months of defending Robert's original decision, had impressed him enough to offer me opportunities based on my own merits rather than my late husband's vision. For the first time in my life, I was being valued for my intelligence, judgment, and business sense rather than my relationships to the men in my family. 6 months after the conservatorship hearing, I hosted a dinner party in my beautifully renovated house, surrounded by new friends who knew me as Margaret the investor, Margaret the entrepreneur, Margaret the woman who'd fought for her independence and won. The storm damage that had started this entire journey was completely erased, replaced by a home that reflected my strength, taste, and vision for my future. As I looked around the table at people who respected my judgment and valued my opinions, I understood that the $30,000 Blake had called too risky to spend had actually been the best investment I'd ever made, an investment in my own worth and capabilities. 2 years have passed since that devastating morning when Blake tried to convince me that repairing my house was financial suicide, and the irony of how wrong he was still takes my breath away. The $30,000 renovation he declared too risky increased my home's value to $220,000. The warehouse investment he dismissed as a scam provided financial security beyond anything Robert and I had achieved during our marriage. The emergency fund he never knew existed gave me the freedom to make choices based on desire rather than necessity. But the most profound change wasn't financial, it was personal. The grief that had made me doubt my own judgment evolved into a deeper understanding of my strength and resilience. I learned that the woman Robert fell in love with, the one he trusted with his secret investments and emergency planning, had been inside me all along, just waiting for permission to emerge. Losing him had been devastating, but discovering myself had been transformative. The relationship with my children remains complicated and painful. Blake eventually filed for bankruptcy and moved back in with Diane in California, where he's slowly rebuilding his life and, I hope, learning to value honesty over manipulation. Diane and I exchange holiday cards and occasional phone calls, but the easy intimacy we once shared has been replaced by careful politeness. Trust, I've discovered, is like bone china. Once broken, it can be mended, but the cracks always show. What I've gained is far more valuable than what I lost. Emma Rodriguez remains my closest friend and business partner, and together we've developed 3 small commercial properties that provide steady income and personal satisfaction. Leonard Hayes continues to offer investment opportunities, and my growing reputation in local real estate circles has led to consulting work that challenges and energizes me in ways I never expected at this stage of life. The house that nearly became the symbol of my incompetence is now the foundation of my independence. The rental apartment provides supplemental income while giving me the satisfaction of helping young professionals establish themselves in their careers. The garden I planted in the backyard, something Robert always promised we'd do when we had more time, blooms magnificently each spring as a reminder that the best time to plant something beautiful is right now. I've also learned to recognize the warning signs of financial manipulation and emotional abuse that I missed when Blake was gradually undermining my confidence. I volunteer with a local senior center, helping other widows and widowers navigate the complex transition to independent financial management. Too many people, I've discovered, face pressure from family members who confuse protection with control, and sharing my experience has helped others recognize their own strength and judgment. The most important lesson has been understanding the difference between being alone and being lonely. For months after Robert's death, I confused solitude with abandonment and sought validation from Blake and Diane that ultimately became a trap. Now I treasure my independence while maintaining meaningful connections with people who value my opinions and respect my decisions. Being unmarried at 54 isn't a problem to be solved, it's a life stage to be embraced and enjoyed. Sometimes I wonder what Robert would think about the woman I've become since his death. The scared, dependent wife who needed his guidance for every financial decision has evolved into someone who makes investment choices, renovates houses, and stands up to family pressure with confidence and clarity. I think he'd be proud, not just of my business success, but of my willingness to honor the trust he placed in my capabilities when he created those secret accounts and investments. The warehouse that started this entire journey has been transformed into Roosevelt Elementary School, and I drive by occasionally to watch children playing in the schoolyard that sits on land Robert chose as our financial foundation. The partnership that Blake called delusional has become a cornerstone of educational development in our community, and knowing that my investment contributes to something meaningful makes the money secondary to the satisfaction. As I finish this story, I'm sitting in my beautifully renovated living room, watching the sunset through windows that frame my garden and planning my next investment project. The storm damage that revealed Robert's letter has been completely erased, but the strength I discovered during those dark months remains. The $30,000 that Blake insisted was too risky to spend became the foundation for everything that followed, not just financial success, but personal transformation and hard-won independence. The greatest risk, I've learned, isn't spending money on what you believe in. The greatest risk is surrendering your judgment to people who benefit from your dependence, even when those people are family members who claim to love you. Sometimes protecting yourself means disappointing the people who expect you to remain small, uncertain, and controllable. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your children is refuse to enable their weaknesses, even when that refusal feels like rejection. I hope this story resonates with anyone who's ever been told they're not capable of understanding their own life, managing their own affairs, or making their own decisions. Age, grief, and inexperience don't automatically equal incompetence, and family concern doesn't always mask family love. Trust your instincts, verify the facts, and remember that the person who benefits from your uncertainty might not be the person you should trust with your future. Before we end, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever faced pressure from family members who confused protection with control? How did you find the courage to trust your own judgment when everyone around you was suggesting you couldn't? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If this story inspired you or helped you think differently about family dynamics and financial independence, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming challenges and finding strength in unexpected places. Share this video with anyone who might benefit from hearing about the importance of standing up for yourself, even when it's difficult. Thank you for taking this journey with me, and remember that it's never too late to discover your own strength, trust your own judgment, and build the life you deserve. Your future self is counting on the courage you show today, and I believe you have everything you need to make decisions that honor your worth and potential. Until next time, keep believing in yourself and never let anyone convince you that you're not capable of amazing things.